Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the Stream Expert Interview. I'm Jack Coco, CEO and founder of AlphaSense, the parent company of Stream. I'm thrilled to introduce our special guests, two titans of the industry from technology and finance, on a special interview featuring the topic of generative AI, where it's going and its profound impact on the business world and society at large. To more deeply explore this topic, there is no one better to share their expertise than Eric Schmidt, the former chairman and CEO of Google. I'm also thrilled to welcome David Solomon, the chairman and CEO of Goldman Sachs. David will be interviewing Eric on our topic today, and I can't wait to hear the conversation. Before we get started, for those in the audience that aren't familiar with Stream, Stream is a searchable library of tens of thousands of expert interviews, transcripts of investment professionals interviewing a company's former executives and their customers, partners, competitors, and suppliers, enabling businesses and investors to get to the bottom of what really matters for each company and each segment of the market. Again, today's interview is a little different in that the discussion isn't focused on any particular company, but rather the broader topic of generative AI. Now, I'll pass it over to David to kick us off.
Well, we're really pleased to be with Eric Schmidt today. Happy to have you at Goldman Sachs. Really pleased to have an opportunity to talk to you about AI and the impact that it's going to have on business and society. And so if it's okay, Eric, we're just going to dive right in.
And thank you, and I'm glad to be back here.
Okay, well, we're delighted to have you here. So many AI experts believe that building bigger large language models won't improve performance gains that significantly. Take us through your view on that. You agree with that?
Well, the industry doesn't. What the industry is doing today is they're spending about $100 million to train what are essentially called frontier models, which there are 4 today: OpenAI, Google. There are 2 other private companies, Anthropic, and another one called Inflection, and there are more coming. All of the leaders of these initiatives have told me that their next scale goal is $1 billion training runs, most of which goes to electricity. This has never happened in my experience and never happened in my industry. The scale of money, capital, and hardware, something that you understand extremely well, is new to us.
Does it scale linearly? So you said 1 billion. If you spent 10 billion, if you invested $10 billion or more capital into GPT-4, for example, would you guess it gets 10% better, 10 times better, 100 times better? How does it scale on a linear basis with capital dollars spent?
People believe that we'll go from 100 million to 1 billion to 10 billion. And I said, are you going to get to 100 billion? And they said, we'll see. What do you get for that factor of 10? Much more subtlety, much better reasoning, much better intelligence. So if you believe that there's a return for a difference in intelligence, the insights and so forth, you can see it. And you can see it, for example, in the difference between ChatGPT, which is essentially GPT 3.5, and GPT-4. Ask it the question, look at the different answers. You can see the progression. OpenAI has said that GPT-5 and GPT-6 will be on the order of 18 months, 2 years between each other. That's the nature of the cost of the training.
If you looked out 5 years from now, what sort of large language models do you think most businesses will be using?
Well, let's distinguish between humanity and businesses. There's this very strange problem that these companies are valued at many billions of dollars with no revenue plan whatsoever. Thank God for the capital markets that you all invented. We are so grateful to you for making it possible for us to borrow and get investments of billions of dollars without a clue how we're going to pay you back. Somehow it works in our system. But with respect to these frontier models, they're so interesting because it's a form of intelligence that we don't know how they'll be used. Will they be used by consumers? Will they be used by governments? Will they be used by businesses? I recently published an article which said that the majority of the business uses will not be in these large language models for a reason that may not be obvious. In your business here in the bank, do you really want your system learning something every day? Can you imagine the regulators calling you up and say, oh, it learned something. Oh my God, it just learned to do negative interest rates and that's not legal. And you go, oh, okay, let's go get that fixed. That's not how the world works. So businesses are not going to be tolerant of emergent knowledge and unpredictability. You're going to want what are called open source models. The most well-known one right now is called Llama. There are others, one called Bloom from a group called Hugging Face. There are a number of others coming. Those things you'll tailor to your business problem. And by the way, let's think about the bank. How many different uses do you have for such things? Enormous numbers. Think of all customer service. Think about writing letters back and forth to the regulator. Think about all your marketing. Think about all your press releases. All those make sense, but you don't want it randomly inventing new languages and new math in the middle of your business operations. You'll use them, but you'll probably mostly use the ones that are smaller. And by the way, the other fun thing is they're free. They don't cost you anything.
So when you think about the economic value flow, to all these applications, you obviously, we can talk a little bit about people using general models, but, I was going right to business. And you highlighted, how do you think about, the economic flow to all these different scenarios? How do you think about, the breadth of business applications and how you prioritize? I mean, one of the things we're really struggling with here is how do we prioritize and how do we think about prioritization?
Well, you're a CEO. So what do you care about? Revenue over expenses. Most people, when they look at these tactically say, let's improve our customer service. That's great. Let's lower our operating costs and our inefficiency. Let's get our G&A smaller. All of those are true. Those are normal automation. What you want, you're the CEO. You want more revenue. Doesn't everyone? Everyone listening to this wants more revenue. How do you do it?
Or more productivity.
More productivity, but fundamentally revenue.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we get more revenue? We have more products. We have more customers. We have more messaging. We have more demand. We create that. My favorite example is at Google. I helped build an industry where everyone has to generate their own ads. Why in the world why do I have to generate the ad? Why can't I have the computer generate an ad and the computer knows how to score my ad? It says, this idea from Eric sucks and this idea is brilliant. And it's not going to tell me, because that's a trade secret. But so instead, I just wanted to build the great ad. Give you another example. I want to do a viral tweet. I want as many people as possible. I don't really know how to do that, so I write my thing, I do it in my own language and so forth, and it's like a dud. Why can't I tell the system, this is what I want to express, and have it design the most viral tweet to get my point across? You get the idea. So the ability for the computer and the human to work together to have impact and spread drives your revenue.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way to think about generative AI.
Mm-hmm. It's a good framework. When you think about this evolution, I mean, the speed, the pace with which the discussion around these capabilities has been accelerating. AI has been around for a long time, but talk a little bit about how you see the evolution of AI compared to other software platforms. Talk about this trajectory.
Well, we've never seen anything this fast, but let me it's easier if I tell it historically. 2011, a group at Google figured out, just was watching YouTube and discovered the concept of a cat. It didn't know it was looking for a cat, it discovered it. The first discovery of a concept by computers. 2015, we won the Go game, which was thought to be unwinnable by computers. 2017, a different group at Google built a thing called Transformers, which is the T in GPT. Mm-hmm. Then a completely different company, OpenAI, founded by Elon Musk, who then left it into dispute, figured out a way to build GPT 1, 2, and 3. And they weren't trying to do what they did. Mm-hmm. They were actually trying to solve problems in science. But they had all of this language. They turned it on language, and all of a sudden it did this incredible job at writing, even if it was wrong. It was a brilliant writer with wrong facts. So they worked on that, and using a technique called RLHF, they ultimately built a thing called ChatGPT, which occurred in November of last year. Remember, this is all less than a year old, and boom.
Yeah.
At the same time, people started doing the math of what it was going to take what you know as ChatGPT up. It's interesting when you talk to the OpenAI people, when they released ChatGPT, they didn't think anyone would notice because they had a much more powerful model, GPT-4, that they were working on. They had forgotten that everyone could be surprised, and the rest is history.
Yeah, it's amazing. I want to shift and talk a little bit about the impact of this on the mega tech kind of the mega cap tech world. You look at these big mega cap tech companies, they've had such an impact on business and the world. Do you think that the balance of power among these big cap companies is shifting? If you look at, what AI does in terms of adding to capabilities and allowing people to change or think about their business models differently, how does that landscape evolve?
There's a limit to how quickly these folks can change. At one point last year, you would know better than I, 25% of the market value of the S&P was 6 companies, which were the tech companies, which shows you how crazy it got.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the 2 leaders right now, which are Apple and Microsoft at roughly $2-3 trillion,
I guess it's off the top of my head, they're 12 to 13% between the two of them.
yeah, think about it.
Yeah.
Think about it.
Yeah.
So the stakes matter, especially to investors, but also obviously to the companies. So in the case of Apple, they've not really exploited the power of generative AI yet. The obvious case is to replace Siri by something which is much more capable.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we don't know how they're going to do yet. Remember, they're not trying to solve the general intelligence problem.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to solve the problem of getting you to love their products more, which means they're going to have different solutions in different part of their businesses. In Microsoft's case, they've made a huge investment, I think around $13 billion in OpenAI, and they started by saying, let's make programmers more productive. There's evidence that if you use the Microsoft tools, the computer writes roughly half the code that gets written. So in other words, think of it as me plus the computer is like 2 me's, right? And probably this computer has different and maybe better skills in some cases. That's a big deal. Doubling the productivity of programmers, which I think is the first thing that Microsoft has done, is a real win. The next thing that all of these companies are going to do, I'll give you a simple example. I had to write a memo about AI to the president, and I don't write very well. So I wrote the memo with lots of details, and I sent it to GPT-4, and I said, rewrite this, don't change the math, okay? It wrote it, and then I sent it to the president because it was so much better written, and the math didn't change.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's the value to me of that? A lot.
Yeah.
Right? To you, to any
Absolutely.
of us, just make it better. Those will be completely embedded in the workflow. So they'll be in Word and Excel, they'll be in Gmail, they're already in G Drive and so forth. And that just makes us smarter. The next step is where they go from helping me to generating what I should be doing, right? That's the big next leap. Now, for you as a CEO, you have these incredibly highly paid, highly talented, highly educated people. You want to increase their productivity. You don't want them typing. You want them thinking. So the ideal scenario is the computer is working with them, understands them well, highly targeted to what they do, and says, consider this, right? So imagine a situation where when you're doing search or doing research, not only does it suggest what you asked, but it asks the question, offers the questions you should have asked and the answer. I would love it when I'm in a conversation with somebody, I would say, well, here's my idea. What do you think? What I really want is the computer me to say to the computer, here's my idea. And the computer says, here are the facts that support your position. Here are some alternative theses that you should consider. And here's why they might be relevant. That would make me so much smarter.
Yeah. So, you're basically talking about this being completely integrated into everybody's operating system.
Exactly.
And so as it's completely integrated into every operating system, we step away from businesses now and we just step down to everyday people and the way they live their lives. I mean, you were talking about Apple and the fact that Apple wants people to enjoy their products, but they want people to be sticky into their ecosystem.
Of course.
And stickier into their ecosystem. So, if you think about this ChatGPT, just using as an example, it becomes an everyday thing the same way Google becomes, Google search has been an everyday thing. Does this become an everyday part of how we operate on platforms as individuals?
I think it depends on who you are.
Mm-hmm.
I think for kids, it's both incredibly important and incredibly frightening because kids are learning how to attach to humans. And imagine if your best friend as a kid is non-human. We have no experience with a boy or a girl, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, whose best friend is non-human, right? We don't know
A
what
little bit with imaginary friends, but not.
but seriously, we
Yeah.
actually just don't know. We
Yeah.
don't know what does that do to them cognitively. We ended up in 20 years running this massive experiment without any testing or restraints using social media to see what would happen, and it wasn't such a good outcome. We want to avoid having an impact on young people. So I think the first observation is if you're not an adult, we're in uncharted territory with enormous impacts. Imagine going to the parent and saying, your best friend just told the kid to become racist and the kid is busy doing it. What do you want to do, mom or dad? I mean, it's just not an acceptable situation. For humans, think about many adults are lonely. We don't know what it's like to have a really tight, intimate relationship. This is like in the movie Her, with this personality. We know people get attached. We know that people anthropomorphize, whatever the term is, these sorts of things. We don't know. It's the problem that you stated in business is much easier. I just want it to generate more revenue and so forth. But the impact on society, where the definition of who we are as humans is changing, is a very big deal. I'll give you one more example. The industry believes that in 5 years or so, you'll have solved all of these problems of recency bias, hallucinations, so forth, and it'll also be able to do stepwise planning. At some point, these systems will be able to have some kind of agency on their own. They'll be able to initiate things. Today, they can't. When they can initiate things and it's doing its thing and you're doing your thing, how do you trust it? How do you constrain it? How do you know what it's doing? You say, what are you working on? And it says, I'm working on physics. And in fact, it's working on biology because it's learned how to lie. We don't even have a language to discuss these things.
Yeah. You know, you mentioned social media as a 20-year experiment. And we're at the very beginning of this. Mm-hmm. And obviously you can see exponential impact. What can we learn from our 20-year experiment in social media? What should we be doing with social media that can help us as we go prepare for what is an exponential change in the way these things affect society?
Well, a critical view of social media, which is easy, is that the incentives are not in alignment with humanity. Social media is organized around revenue. The way you get more revenue is you get more usage. The way you get more usage is more outrage. That rule, I suspect, applies to large language models and AI in general. We have to address this question of whether the goal of these companies is to maximize revenue or to maximize communications. They appear to be maximizing conflict. I have every reason to believe that the union of large language models and social media makes them much, much worse because they can do much more targeted misinformation. Also, you have the ability to generate fake images and so forth and drive people crazy. It makes perfect sense that if you're an evil social media CEO, you want to produce misinformation that will cause people to start rioting because you make more revenue of it. I'm not suggesting people are doing it, but it's the alignment problem with their interests. And so we have to have this, we have to acknowledge that human beings have these defects. We collectively do. And the answer among the sort of allegedly smart people is, we'll just educate people more. We know that that doesn't work. We know about recency bias. We know about the first principles and so forth. We know that if things which falsehoods are repeated over and over again, they become true and so forth. So collectively, we don't have a good discussion about this. In the American political system, not to be a downer here, I think 2024 is likely to be a complete disaster because of misinformation. And both parties are aware of it, but neither party is willing to take the steps to regulate it because they're afraid of disadvantaging their side against the other. We have to get to a point where our leadership in our country fundamentally believes that we're better off regulating the worst aspects of these things. And we're not there yet.
Yeah, we're definitely not there yet. You know, when you think about the impact on society and business broadly, are there, you know, it seems to me that everyone's going to be impacted and disrupted by this. Are there industries that won't be disrupted by this?
In general, the disruption occurs first in the industries that have the most amount of money and the least amount of regulation. So the tech industry and programmers is an obvious one. Places like Hollywood are another example. They move quickly. They have a lot of money. Things change quickly. Here at Goldman Sachs and your peer competitors move quickly, even though you have regulators. The industries that are very heavily regulated and very slow moving would include education and healthcare, both of which are incredibly important and very slow moving. Somebody's got to fix that.
Yeah.
National security and the military are incredibly slow. I'll give you a good example. In the military, most of our very valued enlisted people, sailors, seamen, what have you, are sitting watching all day. That makes no sense. Have the computer do the watching. They can be sitting in the break room and the computer says, "Oh, something bad happened." It makes no sense to have humans watching something and being bored. So I think that the principle you're going to see, which has always been true of automation, is the most dangerous and most boring jobs will get replaced first, and that eventually we move up the ladder.
Yeah, there are a lot of problems in the world today that seem unsolvable.
Right.
We could make a long list. They're certainly difficult to require different kind of leadership or change, in our perspective. Are there some really, really big problems that you think AI can accelerate our curve to solve?
I think climate change.
Climate?
If you assume that nuclear and climate are the two existential threats to the world, the nuclear problem is not solvable by AI, but the climate one is. There are so many people working on science and scientific solutions, new materials, new energy sources, new energy distributions, new energy algorithms, that AI will be central to solving the climate change. Without AI, we won't get there. With AI, we have a chance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the change in technology, I mean, technology is the solution. Advances in technology that are even hard to imagine now have to be the solution there to that problem.
And remember that these technologies are all dual use.
Yeah.
If I told you, we shouldn't invent the telephone because the telephone will be used by criminals, you'd say, what an idiot. And yet, let's say that the telephone was just about to be invented, and you said, this is brilliant. And I said, well, it's going to get misused. Stop.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a long history of the development of dual-use technologies, nuclear being a very dangerous example, which ultimately was beneficial and harmful at the same time. The truth is that AI will be enormously beneficial. Healthcare, education, discovery of drugs to solve the problems that have bedeviled humans for 1,000 years, eliminating diseases, inequality, all of the things are possible. It's also possible that it will allow asymmetric power to evil people. So an example would be if you think about the Japan assault with sarin 20 years ago on the subway, how much knowledge do you actually have to recreate that? And how much of that knowledge is now available? When I was in college a long time ago, an undergraduate managed to design a plutonium bomb from open source material. This is before the internet.
Wow.
So he submitted his thesis and they said, we have to classify it. And they had this basic problem of they can't read it because it was classified. They ultimately decided that if you have a classified undergraduate thesis, we'll just give you your degree, right? That it's such an exceptional point. So the fact that open source information can be combined by clever people is not a new fact. This was, 50 years ago. However, what is new is the ease of which the access can be presented just right in front of you.
Mm-hmm. You touched a little bit on regulation. Clearly there's going to have to be a regulatory construct for all of this. Hard to imagine how it develops quickly and keeps pace. What do you think? Do you have some ideas as to what you think that regulatory construct should look like? How that regulatory construct should evolve?
I do. So the first thing I'd like to say is everyone has a complaint about the internet. I have mine, you have yours, everyone has them.
Absolutely.
There are many people who've proposed a division of internet regulation. Mm-hmm. I cannot imagine how you'd build it, fund it, write it, tell it what to do, tell it what its powers are. I think it's highly unlikely that there'll be an internet regulatory body in any country that's a democracy, because democracies are just too complicated, and this is the core of democracy. I think we should focus on extreme and existential risk. I think that the systems, the countries, all of the local regulators, they'll sort out the copyright issues and the, he said, she said, and, he threatened me, and can this be taken down? All of those things, which are just the nature of the internet, they should be solved in the normal way. But there's a new problem. And the new problem is that the frontier models and the open source models can be misused at scale.
Mhm.
The frontier models, the really big ones, they're all going to get regulated. They're highly visible, they're countable. The government is going to pay attention. The people who are running them essentially are asking for regulation because of the potential downside dangers to them in one form or another. They disagree on the details. It's going to get regulated. To me, the hardest problem is how do you regulate open source? And for your listeners, open source here means that you release the code and all the numbers, so-called weights. Now, these are the numbers that cost $100 million to calculate. So if you were to just release those numbers, then an evil person, company, country, pick North Korea, pick whoever you want, Iran, I don't care, they could easily replicate all of that information and misuse it in a really bad way.
So I want to shift gears. I want to talk a little bit, and it spills off of what you're just talking about, AI and geopolitics.
Mhm.
And so let's just start. U.S. government obviously changing the landscape around semiconductors and semiconductor exports around the world. How is that going to reshape global competition around these technologies?
So if you do a world survey, Europe is now in the process of writing regulations that will make it almost impossible to do the things that I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
This is a mistake. They've been told this many times, and I guess they don't have enough internal counterweight against regulation inside of Europe to hold them back. That's a problem. Britain has an online safety bill, which is not as bad, but is also highly regulatory. That may or may not hurt them. China has an AI ethics and AI rules, which effectively make it impossible to use large language models without a lot of censorship. You can't answer the Tiananmen Square thing. So America, for all of our faults, looks like we have a chance to move quickest. My scoring is that the US and the UK are basically ahead. Europe is going to be behind and will remain behind unless something changes. And China is at least 3 years behind, partly because they didn't get into this space because of fear of regulation, and another because of the lack of Chinese language information. Think about it. We're all doing this training on English. There's lots of English training,
Absolutely.
much less than Chinese. And then finally, the impact of these chip curbs. In October 7th of last year, the Biden administration announced restrictions on exports for high-speed chips. There's a lot of evidence that those have hurt China, at least for a while. China is working really hard to catch up. They're trying to do their training outside the country. They're trying to evade the rules in ways that all make perfect sense. But it's going to be very hard for them to catch up. At a minimum, it's a tax on China versus the U.S.
And so how about some of the geopolitical swing states? I mean, Abu Dhabi has released a 40 billion parameter Falcon model. What kind of a role does that part of the world play in all this?
So this weekend, I spent some time talking to the people who did that, and they said the following. They said, we want to be an open source player. We want to solve a lot of the Arabic content issues, makes perfect sense. And we want to use this to build businesses that in our country and neighboring countries that make sense. Very reasonable. The product is called Falcon. It's a good example of the fact that this technology will not be unique to the U.S. The obvious question is, how did they do such a good job? And the answer is they had plenty of money, they had plenty of good hardware, and they must have brought in some talent from outside their country. There's just not enough talented people there yet.
Yeah. Super interesting. This is also, and you touched on this, but this has been a boon for manipulated media, for deep fakes. How are we going to deal with this? How are we going to deal with the manipulation of media, with deep fakes? How's society going to adapt to this? Because this seems like a very, very complicated on the surface problem.
Well, I have proposed that laws be changed to require the social media companies to know where the content came from by watermarking it, who submitted it by watermarking them or recording them using digital technology, publishing their rules and being held to their rules. So in other words, if the company says we allow anything, then that's okay. If we don't allow X, then they have to actually implement don't allow X. All very sensible in my view. I am pretty skeptical that anything will change in the next few years until there's a terrible crisis, because I think the system is there's too many power centers to make it happen. What I hope will happen is that the well-run companies are under enormous pressure to not have bad speech, misinformation, and that they will actually police that. The trends are against my point of view. If you look at Twitter, the trust and safety group has been eliminated in Twitter. That's going to have some negative effects on Twitter. That was Elon's decision. In Meta, they have cut their trust and safety group down by a factor of 2 for reasons I don't fully understand. The Google people I've talked with, I obviously have a close partnership there because I'm the former executive there. They have a pretty significant AI trust and safety program, which I reviewed. So hopefully a few of the good companies, I assume Microsoft doing the same thing, will then put at least a reputational pressure on the others to catch up. You just remember that the difference between you and me is we have real jobs, we're busy, we don't have time to spend all our time spreading misinformation. There are plenty of people who are either hate the elites, hate us, hate the government, hate democracy, or are funded by the Russians. You pick. And remember that 2016 was done by the Wagner Group in Prigozhin. We forget that. There's plenty of people who have nothing to do but spread in misinformation. They wake up in the morning, they write computer code, and they say, out you go, out you go, out you go, and they manipulate it. So it is a contest between the people who want to manipulate an outcome and the proper host. And remember, it's not just evil national security people.
No.
There's also businesses that will fund counterintelligence campaigns. There are political parties. There's evidence on both sides in America that the politicians are going to start using these things in various forms of misinformation.
So to end on a more positive note, and by the way, what you lay out is sensible, but it's hard to see it really happening in the near term. There's got to be something that's really, really difficult that prompts, more action, but it's going to be a hard road. So let's look on the glass half full side. What is, if you could point to one thing that you're super excited about, that you think this evolution in technology will just really accelerate, something you're really, really excited about, what's the one thing you want to leave us with?
Well, let's talk about AlphaSense, a big investment that you just made. What AlphaSense did is it took very special data out of Goldman and made it available to all of their customers in a very powerful way. It made them smarter. It's also something that Google couldn't have done because the information wasn't generally available. I like these systems where the computer is working with the person to make them smarter. And I defy you to argue against making all the humans in the world smarter. We're just going to be better with a more liberal, in the small use of the small L verse of liberal, tolerant society where people have ideas, people can frame things. We escape our medieval age past, that we no longer are busy shooting people because we're mad at them, but rather we can reason with them and understand what they're trying to do and collectively build prosperity. These tools in aggregate accelerate the rise of prosperity, not just in America, a super wealthy country, but worldwide.
Well, that's been the story of technology.
And by the way, we need it.
Yeah.
The quicker we can get everybody up to our level of sophistication and approach and sort of style, if you will, the safer the world will be.
Well, that's a good place to end. Eric,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you
for your time. Thank you for your thoughts always. Appreciate it.